Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Could you please state your name for the record?
Sure. Jeffrey Horne.
And what is your occupation?
I'm the city administrator for the city of Clinton.
How long have you been the city administrator?
13 months.
What did you do prior to coming here?
I was the city administrator in Mitchellville,
How long were you there?
3 years.
When did you become aware that we had an issue in the city with ambulance billing?
I knew about the case not too long after I started, but I didn't know. The city attorney left just over a month after I started, and we had only had very cursory discussions about it, nothing in depth, only that it was going on.
At some point, you became more involved and more aware of this
That's right,
action?
earlier this year.
And how did that come about?
Dave Pillars was the acting city attorney at the time, and Mike Walker had gotten all the materials that had been requested of him at that time, sent through and gone over that, at which point he came back to discuss that with myself and with the council.
And what was your role in this litigation?
I participated, I was in the meetings with the council when we discussed the ongoing issue, and then also I represented the city at the hearing.
What did you do in response to the lawsuit, you personally?
At the time, we couldn't go into it in great detail because a lot of our discussions were in closed session. So what I did first was instruct the fire chief in his evaluation to go forward and get trained to make sure the coding was done correct. That was the first thing, and that was in April.
Whose responsibility is it in the city of Clinton to make sure that the coding is accurate?
The fire department's responsibility.
Sarah Nolan is not responsible for that?
Sarah Nolan is a clerk, is a processor. She merely works with the software to make sure the bills get out and we get collections. We don't ask her to do anything more than that.
You've never trained her to make sure that she knew how to do, read a narrative report and enter codes, a certified coder or anything like that?
No, we didn't.
That's always been since before you got here, and currently that's the fire department's responsibility.
That was the way it was when I got here. That's correct.
And the EMS director
Yeah.
is the individual that is tasked with that.
That was my understanding, yes.
And in practice, that's the way it worked, correct?
That's correct.
Following as you got into this, at some point the case settled. And then what was your next task?
Well, you know, as part of the settlement, once the settlement was over, the city, we discussed about how we were gonna respond, and that we felt that the judgment was large enough that we had to have some action and some consequence to what happened.
Okay. And ultimately, it's your responsibility to make those determinations?
You know, I think we made it as a consultative decision, but ultimately, I'm the chain of command, I'm the next one up above the fire chief.
And when you say we,
You know, we talked about it.
who's we?
Without getting into great detail, you know, we had discussions with the council about the personnel involved.
Ultimately, you made a decision to terminate Chief Reagan-Weather and and Andy McGovern.
But, we made the decision that they needed we made the decision that they needed to go. However, we gave them the opportunity to resign first. So we did not terminate them just immediately.
Neither of them resigned.
Correct.
Okay. And so then what happened next?
We kept open channels between, they proceeded after I had meetings with them and with the human resource director, and I had meetings with each one of them, at which we told them that we'd like to resign. At that point, we didn't, get a answer right there in the spot. We anticipated that. Both of them sought counsel. We worked through counsel and made sure we followed it and tried to work things out before we came to the agreement then to go ahead with the termination.
What was the information that you relied upon to determine the discipline was necessary, and the termination was necessary in this
The
case?
size of the settlement was one which we felt demanded a strong response.
And why was it then Mr. McGovern and Mr. Regenweather that you decided to terminate?
Mr. McGovern, because he was the closest involved with the billing issue in question, and then Mr. Regenweather as the department head of the department involved.
When you say closest involved, what do you mean?
Worked actually with the issue, talked to during our case, the Schulteis case, had worked with our attorneys, and we knew was the one primarily involved in the documentation and the billing process. I would call our documentation to billing process.
Okay, was that his responsibility to make
Yeah.
sure that? What other reasons, with regard to Mr. McGovern, did you have for terminating him?
Well, that was that, and we wanted to make sure that, that it was gonna be done correctly going forward, and that we got it on track. So that was the beginning, a complete changeover in the personnel who did it, and then our procedure as well.
What do you mean your procedure?
Well, we started to talk about that we needed to outsource the billing practice itself.
Okay, and why is that?
We wanted to avoid this kind of incident again. We looked carefully at firms and having them provide training to our staff to make sure our documentation was correct, and just to have more eyes looking at it with more of an expertise level brought in.
What did you feel from your involvement in this litigation? What do you think happened here?
I think we had a case where the rules are not being understood correctly. I don't really assign motive or anything like that to it. It's just the nature of it is the city ended up having to pay a large settlement because of it, and we had to respond.
And why did you think this was the proper response?
Because, again, the size of the settlement was so large, we felt that it warranted a response like that.
How about with the Mr. Regenweather? What were your reasons? What was your thought process in deciding to terminate him?
Well, mainly because he was the department head of the department involved, and we felt like that in talking to Mr. Walker, that Mark wasn't very involved in the case and made a point of telling us that it was Mr. McGovern's primary responsibility, but we found that to be unacceptable
Why was that?
because it was something major going on within his department.
Now, you decided to terminate Mr. Regenweather as fire chief, right? Which is a non-civil service. But you then went further and determined that he would not be part of the fire department at all. That he'd be terminated completely from the city. Tell me why you did that.
We just thought it would create a difficult situation possibly within. I thought it was kind of splitting hairs to try to separate the two.
What do you mean?
Well, I thought it would be difficult to have, with the emotions involved in this things going on, to create possibly a difficult workplace within the department.
In what way?
Just maintaining difficult, possibly interpersonal relationships with a new chief and those types of things. I was concerned about that.
Any other reasons that you had for determining termination?
No.
In what way did you feel that Mr. Regenweather failed to carry out his duties in the department?
I felt like once the Schulteis case came to light, that there should have been a stronger response at that point.
Such as?
Such as, dealing directly, making sure, having the work possibly audited, or those types of things. It was a tough situation at the time for me, because a lot of what we were discussing, the case was not fully signed off. We weren't, yet I was still tied by confidentiality in terms of the closed sessions and things, so I couldn't get into a lot of that with him, and a lot of other specifics that might lead into more info about the case.
Through this, did you become aware that Mr. Schulteis had complained about the way the billing practices were in the fire department, or the coding practices in the fire department since 2007?
I did find out, yes. I found that out later on as I got to know more about the case.
And did that play a role in your decision?
I think somewhat because of the timing of it.
What do you mean?
Well, just that there was a lot of time in between and not much had changed, and I was concerned that we were, at that point, nothing was moving fast enough in order to try to head this off.
What other reasons did you have to decide that Mr. Regenweather had committed misconduct?
That was the primary reason.
Anything else?
No.
With regard to Mr. McGovern, in what ways did you feel that he had neglected his duty or committed misconduct?
I felt that he had just gotten it wrong. We'd been doing this process wrong for some time, and that it was leaving the door open for the city to have a fairly serious liability.
And why was it his responsibility to correct
Because he
that?
was the primary person, the overseer of EMS, and dealt with the billing and actually directly dealt with the finance department in terms of how they billed.
Did you feel his actions were reckless or intentionally indifferent, as stated in the lawsuit?
I felt that they were not adequate for the situation or how he handled it.
In what
So it was
way?
either ignorance or, I don't know the motive exactly, but ignorance of the system or something which led to this liability that the city is carrying or potentially open to.
From what you know of this case, did you feel that the way the fire department was coding and operating and I use the term billing, but was incorrect?
Once I got on and looked at it more, and again, I didn't really start to examine it until the middle of this year, probably. I'm not an expert in those types of areas, so with my limited knowledge, I relied upon, some of the experts that we had talked to about it for my information.
were you satisfied with the explanations that Mr. McGovern had given to Mr. Walker or Mr. Wolfberg with regard to how this came about?
No, especially after talking with them and meeting about it.
Do you have any other reasons for warranting termination that would constitute neglected duty or misconduct?
No other reasons.
When was the decision made to terminate?
Oh, near the end of September.
I have nothing further at this time.
Mr. Fry?
Thank you. Mr. Horne, you said that you consulted with your HR director on the decision to terminate Mark.
We did talk about it, yes.
Did you ask for his advice on the decision to terminate?
No, not directly. I do not remember that.
Is that something you would normally do if you were considering a termination, is to ask for the advice of your HR director?
I may or may not, depending on the circumstance.
In this case, you did not ask for his advice.
No.
You felt that you could not share the reasons for termination with Mark when you originally talked to him, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
You brought him in and said, I need you to either resign or be fired, and I can't tell you why.
I intimated to him, I believe that he knew the general subject was this case.
The Schulteis case.
Correct.
He asked you for an explanation of why
He
you were
did.
making the decision, and
He
what did you
did.
tell him?
I told him I couldn't get in there and talk about it in a closed session or in a mediation.
You talked to the mayor about the decision to terminate also,
I did.
and the mayor was uneasy about that decision, at least to remove Mark from the fire department.
Yes.
He didn't want to go that far.
But the mayor was uneasy with going that far.
Yes. The mayor recognized that Mark was an extremely valuable firefighter, didn't he?
I'm not gonna guess what the mayor meant by that.
He didn't tell you why, but he said he was uneasy about terminating.
He voiced his concerns.
Did you talk with any of the command level personnel in the fire department about their opinions as to whether Mark would be able to still continue in the department if he wasn't chief?
No, I did not.
When you did your evaluation of Mark in February of 2010, April 29th of 2010, you wrote underneath the evaluation, just a few of the comments. One was strengths. Mark does what I ask of him and works for the team. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And in April, you had already talked with Mike Walker and you knew what was going on with the lawsuit.
I didn't know the settlement at that point, or the size. I knew the lawsuit was going on. Didn't have any predisposition about what the future would hold at that point.
What you knew was that Walker had some concerns. You did not know the economics of that concern. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, in that April, and this is Exhibit R5 that I'm looking at, is Mark's evaluation of April 29th, 2010. It looks to me like a pretty good evaluation. Looks like you got 4s and 5s on a scale of 5 in all categories. Correct?
I believe that's correct. I don't have it in front of me, but yeah, I believe that's correct.
And you made a notation on the bottom, it's R5, Commissioners, R-5. You made a notation on the bottom of the evaluation, make sure billing is done correctly and calls are coded correctly for EMS. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the reason that you made that notation was because you had had that discussion with Mike Walker.
Yes, correct.
Now, at that time, and for all of the time that we've been talking about, billing was actually done in the finance department, correct?
The processing, yes, was done in the finance department.
You served as Director of Finance for Johnson County for a time before you came here, did you not?
Budget director.
Budget Director. Was that Finance Department?
No, it was for the board of supervisors.
I see. Did Johnson County have an EMS billing service?
Johnson County has an EMS service. They build internally themselves.
And was that done in your department?
No, that was done within their own department.
In another
They were
department?
a county department. They had their own billings person on staff within the ambulance
Okay.
department.
Wasn't done by the fire department?
No,
Why not?
because it was a countywide service there. Ambulance was countywide. It didn't, they shared with some of the fires, but they were not part of the fire departments. They were a separate county standalone department.
You did not believe that you as acting finance director had any responsibility for billing or coding, is that correct?
Once I knew that there was a problem, I believed I had responsibility to do something with that.
In fact, had you not been talking about outsourcing and had you not gotten information about outsourcing from Mark early in 2010?
I don't recall that.
The request for proposal that you sent out, that didn't just happen in a week's time, did it?
No.
That's something you've been working on for quite a while.
I generally get a boilerplate RFP from the International City County Management Association, and worked off of that.
Do you remember when you first started working on the request for proposal?
I don't exactly remember the starting point.
Did you send a draft of it to Mark before he was placed on administrative leave?
I believe I did, yes, I believe that's right.
So that was something you were already discussing with Mark before you made the decision to terminate?
Yeah. I would say we had in-depth when we were starting, and I had them at least review the document.
So that's one thing that he did in response to your suggestion that he get the billing and coding correctly
Yeah.
done. He also sent, he himself went and took 2 firefighters with him to a seminar put on by Page, Wolfberg, and Worth in St. Louis.
Right.
Did he not?
Yes, I believe he did.
And Reagan Weather Exhibit R9, Commissioners, I'm sorry, R10. R9, there is a confirmation of Mark's attendance at the seminar, which was, and the confirmation was dated April 26th of 2010. It's actually held May 3rd and 4th in St. Louis. Would that sound about right?
That sounds about right, yeah. I knew it was shortly after that.
And that was also an effort to implement the instruction that you gave to him to make sure that billing and coding were done correctly.
Correct.
Exhibit R7 is an ambulance survey of Iowa fire departments. Were you aware that Mark had conducted an ambulance survey?
Prior to that time, no.
Okay, are you now aware?
Yes.
Was that actually done before Mark's evaluation?
I don't recall that, no.
Do you remember what the purpose of the ambulance survey was?
No.
Have you seen it?
I've seen parts of it, not the whole thing, just some of the results.
Well, would that be an effort to determine what other departments are doing with regard to ambulance billing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, and as part of that, he was looking at whether billing should be outsourced and what other departments were doing with outsourcing of billing, and also looking at their various collection rates.
Right.
What was the significance of collection rates?
Our collection rate wasn't the best, so we were trying to see if we could do better.
And that had to do with basically revenue to the city.
Yeah.
All the revenue from ambulance billing went into the city's general fund, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Fire department didn't get any of that revenue in the department,
No, they're not standalone budgets like that.
right? And certainly, neither Mark Regenweather nor Andy McGovern put any money in their pocket as a result of any of this billing issue.
No, I don't think so.
Exhibit R12 are some policy revisions that were done in the Clinton Fire Department. Were you aware of those?
Not till later.
They were effective May 28th, 2010. And there were three, you've seen them. They were three very detailed policies that had to do with, in particular, one had to do with patient care reports for the ambulance service and requirements for compliance. And that was within a month after you gave Mark instructions to make sure that Medicare billing and coding was being done correctly, right?
It would be about a month later.
Yes. And in addition to that, there was a request from Mark to send several city staff, both fire department and finance department staff, to training to become certified coders for ambulance billing, correct?
We talked about that.
And
Yeah.
that was also a response to your instruction to Mark to do something to make sure that billing and coding were being done correctly.
Right.
And you were here when Mr. Ireland testified about coming to the Clinton Fire Department and putting on classes for documentation. That was in the summer of 2010. That was another response to your instruction to make sure that ambulance billing and coding were being done correctly in the Clinton Fire Department.
At least partially, sure.
So we've talked about 5 or 6 things, it sounds like, that were done within a matter of months after you asked Mark to make sure that billing and coding were being done correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And even though you gave him that directive, you had information that would have been valuable for him to know that you did not communicate to him, right?
Which information?
Well, the information that came from Mr. Wolfberg. You didn't tell Mark that information.
I didn't feel like I could talk about it.
The city had spent nearly $200,000 looking into this matter with attorneys and experts, and you gave Mark instructions to solve the problem, but didn't feel like you could tell him what you had learned as a result of that expenditure.
I gave instructions once I knew that there was a problem. I felt that I had to give instructions to who was there. I did that.
But you're setting him up for failure if you don't give him all the information, aren't you?
Couldn't give him information that was from a closed session. Or a mediation, closed mediation.
Well, as it turns out, the discussion of the 70% rule was not in any closed session. Sarah Nolan heard about it back in December. You never told Mark about it, did you?
I don't know if I even knew that in December.
Yeah, but that wasn't something that was confidentially determined in closed session if it was known by Sarah.
We never talked about it before, and if it was known in December, I don't recall ever having that discussion with him or anyone else about that rule.
Yeah. But you knew about it
Oh, boy.
at some point.
I may have known about it, but didn't think much of it at that point.
Okay? And why not?
I didn't know that much about the case until, really that much about the case until April, late March.
Wasn't one of the benchmarks that you used to determine whether Mark was complying with your instructions was whether or not the ALS percentage was going down for Clinton Fire Department billing?
That was one of the things we looked at.
That was the only thing you looked at, wasn't it?
I don't, we certainly paid a lot of attention to it.
Yeah. In fact, you told me that that's how you knew that Mark was not implementing your instructions.
We looked at, see what the numbers were, we just took a sampling of the numbers and they weren't going down to those levels.
Yeah, but you never told Mark what you expected the number to be. And you never told him why you
Sorry.
expected that number to be lower.
Yeah, I, once again, just didn't want to get into what could have been, confidential discussions.
You said that Mark and Andy didn't take Tim Schulteis seriously. What investigation did you conduct to make that determination?
We checked and no response had come from the original complaint. There was no response at all to it. That's basically the, there was nothing done at the time.
Wasn't it the fact that the percentage of ALS calls didn't change, so you assumed they did nothing?
I wouldn't say I assumed they did nothing, but it just wasn't down to what we thought it should be.
But you did not go into the fire department and talk to anybody, any of the other command officers, and ask what they did in response to the Schulteis complaint?
No.
You didn't talk to Andy about what he did in response to the Schulteis complaint? No?
No.
You didn't talk to Mark about what he did in response to the Schulteis complaint? Did you?
No, I didn't really talk about it. Once I really started to find out more about the case, a lot of it I couldn't even share with him at that point. That was just the unfortunate nature of the timing of me coming into the event.
And Mark was also under constraints of confidentiality because Mike Walker had instructed him that what they talked about and what he knew about the case wasn't to go outside the room. Wasn't that true?
I don't know about that, I wasn't in it.
The city stopped billing altogether in August of 2010, didn't they?
Correct,
That was after Mark and Andy were placed on administrative leave
correct.
because the other firemen didn't want to touch it.
I don't know about that.
They didn't know what to do differently.
We wanted to make sure that our process was right, so we stopped it then until we felt we were comfortable to get it going again.
You talked to somebody about a 70% rule. Mike Brown and Joel Atkinson, right?
After the fact that it did come out, yes.
Both of them said, I don't know how to achieve a 70% target, right?
They said that they needed help.
Yeah. They needed to bill the calls based on what they saw and what they were dispatched for, and they couldn't shoot for any kind of a 70% target. Right?
We want to be sure they were done correctly.
And if you wanted them to shoot for a target, they wanted that in writing.
They never asked me for anything in writing.
And the way you solved the problem was to actually go ahead and hire an outside company to do the billing.
The council approved, the council, we looked at some, examined and brought a proposal to the council if we took RFPs.
Which is exactly what you and Mark were talking about before putting him on administrative leave.
Yeah.
You never told Mark to have an audit done. Probably wasn't a prudent expenditure of money since you were already spending a large sum of money on Mr. Wolfberg and Mr. Walker and his staff.
Yes, we were.
So you were getting that information, but you couldn't share it with Mark.
Right.
When you talked with Paul Walter about this case, he didn't lead you to believe that it was anything significant, did he?
No, Paul and I had very little discussion on this case, but cursory.
He thought it was a case filed by a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind, didn't he?
That I'm not sure of.
Mark has always had outstanding, at least above average evaluations. Both as a firefighter, he started at the bottom and worked his way up to chief over 30 years. And his evaluations have always been at least above average and often exemplary, wouldn't you agree?
I don't disagree.
He's been evaluated by your predecessors, Gary Bowden and Jeff Koistra, and they all evaluated him highly.
I believe that's the case.
There was an evaluation by Gary Bowden done in 2008, June 2nd of 2008. It's Exhibit R5. Page 2. And down at the bottom, Mr. Show it to you. What did Mr. Bowden have to say about Mark?
He wrote here, probably our best department director.
Yeah, sure is. I didn't hear that very well.
Is that Exhibit R5?
Exhibit R5, page 4 of the second page of Gary Bowden's evaluation. He said Mark was probably our best department director. Mr. Horne, you're not sure if the procedure code that's put on by the paramedic personnel is the same as the billing code that's used that's sent to Medicare.
That's correct, I'm not sure.
The mediation that you attended, that wasn't a hearing, was it?
No.
That was a discussion to see if the case could be settled.
Yeah.
And once you heard that the potential downside to the case might be $20 or $30 million. How'd you react to that?
I was very concerned
And why?
because the city would be looking at bankruptcy.
So once you heard the possibility of $30 million, you were looking for a way to get this case settled because you were afraid that would bankrupt the city.
That's correct.
And at the mediation session, there was really no debate about the merits of the case, only about the damages, right?
That's right.
You didn't ask Mark to sit in on the mediation,
I didn't personally, no.
even though he's the department head whose head is now on the block because of the settlement. You didn't think it was important to have his input on whether or not the city ought to settle this case.
Andrew was involved in it, so we had some representation from there. He was the person that knew more about it, and we felt he would be more important to have at the mediation.
In fact, Mark was on vacation when the mediation session was held. Is that correct?
That could be.
Did Mark have any idea that the city was thinking about settling this case for $4.5 million before you and he talked about him having to either resign or be fired?
No.
Did you think it might be prudent to ask him what he thought about a settlement of $4.5 million before the city went ahead and did it?
I would like to have, and I felt I could.
After all, he'd been in the fire department for over 30 years and knew all the guys in the fire department and knew the people that you could talk to get information if you needed to. But he was left out of the loop.
That's right.
Now, you've talked about the responsibility of a supervisor for a person to whom he delegates authority. That's basically what you're talking about with Mark. He's the guy, he was relying on Andy and delegated authority, but he didn't follow up. Correct?
And what, I guess I'm not understanding what you're asking.
So that Mark delegated authority
Yeah.
to Andy, but that he, once having delegated that authority, did not take an active role
Right.
in following up.
Yes.
And yet, what was your follow-up after asking Mark to make sure that Medicare coding and billing was properly done?
We would have had it at the next evaluation, I would have re-examined it again to see if their progress been made,
Next evaluation never happened.
right?
You
At
didn't,
the time of that evaluation, I didn't know that that was gonna be the end result.
you didn't know that Mark had done the ambulance study. You did know that he went to St. Louis. You didn't know
I
about,
knew he went to St. Louis.
I say you did know that he went to St. Louis. You did not know about the policy changes that were made in the fire department. You did not know about the classes that were taught by Kip Ireland.
I didn't know about his classes, no.
Were those things that would be important to know if you were following up on the directive?
Yeah, if we would've gotten to that point again, yes.
The difference between an ALS level call and a BLS level call is $45, is that your understanding?
That's my understanding.
So what we're talking about here on an individual call is 45 bucks.
Yes, that's fine.
If you're upgrading a BLS to an ALS, you're talking about 45 bucks.
In the reimbursement rate, correct.
did you make any determination as to how much Medicare may have been overbilled if the allegations were correct in the lawsuit?
No, we were looking more at the damages. We never ran a direct difference.
Didn't you think it was important to know how much was involved in terms of
Well, we
the
knew
alleged
it.
overbill?
We knew it was less considerably. I mean, we knew it was, the fine was gonna be by far larger than the difference was.
Did the city's legal department have any role in determining whether the city was in compliance with Medicare billing rules and regulations?
Since I've been here, no. I've worked with 3 attorneys since I've been here, 13 months.
You think they should have some responsibility in reviewing laws and regulations that affect the city and expose the city to liability?
I think that it's best, if, any kind of legal questions that they take the kind of advice of counsel, yeah.
You're not aware of any violations of law that Mark Regenweather has committed?
No.
City administrator is responsible for supervision and oversight of all city department heads, is that correct?
Except for the city attorney.
Okay. There's a city organizational chart at Exhibit R-1.
Yeah.
That's a correct structure for the city's
Yeah, I think so.
administration. And in that chart, it shows at the top that the mayor and the city council are up there toward the top. The city administrator is underneath the mayor and the council, correct?
Correct.
City attorney is underneath the council, so the council appoints the city attorney. And then all the department heads are under the city administrator, so
Right.
oversight of those departments are the city administrator's responsibility,
Correct.
city administrator being you and your predecessors.
That's right.
That's the case.
When you gave Mark instructions about making sure that Medicare coding and billing was accurate, was there still a finance director in the finance department?
No, she was gone at that point.
Had you previously given her any instructions about making sure that Medicare coding and billing were accurate?
No.
You agree that in a system where compliance is important, it is wise to have checks and balances in place?
I agree.
Does the city have any checks and balances in place on ambulance billing?
There really weren't any in the situation as it was, because Sarah was a processor rather than a coder. I think that's one of the things that we're trying to get at as we make the change here, is that we have more than one set of eyes looking at it.
Would you agree that when confronted with an allegation, the city is in violation of federal law, that the mayor and the city council have an obligation to give some directives to the city staff in terms of dealing with that as well?
Yes.
Were there any directives given to city staff, to your knowledge, or to you as city administrator with regard to the lawsuit by the mayor and the council?
No, not really directives.
Because nobody thought that this was a serious matter, did they?
I don't know that, the answer to that question.
You didn't think it was serious until early this year.
I knew the case was going on, I didn't know it was that serious until March of this year, that'd be correct.
If that was the attitude of the council and the mayor and virtually everybody else in city administration, it might just be possible that Mark might have the same opinion. Would you agree?
But it's possible.
You're aware that Mark Regenweather, after having served this city for over 30 years, is within a year and a half of retirement?
Yes,
Because people who serve in dangerous jobs like firefighter and police get to retire a little sooner than people who sit behind a desk.
correct.
And you recognize that terminating Mark as a firefighter will have an impact on his retirement
That's
pension
right.
for the balance of his life.
That's right, that's why we didn't want to terminate him. We wanted him to resign. That's why we asked him to resign first.
Well, resignation would not make any difference in his pension, would it?
Well, we didn't want to do anything, we asked him to resign, that was one of the reasons I was afraid that I didn't want anything else that would affect him from the outside.
But you did not know whether resignation would make any difference in his pension as opposed to termination, did you?
I wasn't sure, so I took this, that's why, one of the reasons I went that way.
If he continues as a firefighter, even though he's not chief, he will not lose nearly as much in his retirement pension as if he either resigned or was terminated short of his full retirement age of 55, correct?
Correct.
During this termination process, or when it was discussed, there was an opportunity extended for Mark to file a response or reasons, a suggestion of reasons why he should not be terminated. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that is Exhibit R-19, a letter dated September 27th, 2010, that was written by me to David Pillars. You're familiar with that?
Oh,
You reviewed that letter?
yeah. Yeah, I haven't seen it in a while.
Okay. Well, the letter starts by talking about a meeting that Chief Regenweather, former City Attorney Paul Walter, and Andy McGovern attended with the U.S. Attorney. That was in response, I gather, to the letter to the Chief and Mayor Horne from the U.S. Attorney's Office in 2009. And that they went to the meeting, and at the meeting, they asked the U.S. Attorney to notify him if they were doing anything wrong. And that there were no notifications received from the U.S. Attorney's Office following that meeting. Did you take that into consideration when you decided to terminate Mark?
No, because I thought the U.S. Attorney's Office was investigating. I don't think they were reviewing it as a regular, discussion.
Do you think that coding for ambulance calls is a complicated matter?
I think it's somewhat complicated.
There's an exhibit. I don't want to hurt your arms or your back, but I'm gonna leave that with the commission. And I think you'll find that that's just a part of regulations that deal with ambulance billing and coding. Would you agree?
Yep, and if it's a federal regulation, I'm not surprised.
Would it surprise you that a fireman might not understand all those?
It wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. Would it surprise you if a lawyer didn't understand all of them? May I park these here?
Right there. Tip over the chair.
R16. Do you believe that ambulance billing depends on the care given to the patient in the field?
Yeah, I think that definitely.
And that's after your participation in the mediation sessions and your discussions with attorneys for the city?
And just what I've learned, once, in general, what I've been able to learn myself just from that time forward.
Do you have an understanding of the ALS assessment rule?
I don't have a complete understanding of it.
What's your understanding?
Just from that is assessing them vis-a-vis getting in the field and following a test. I don't know all the specifics.
Does it have anything to do with the determination of whether the call is advanced life support or basic life support?
Yes.
And what does it have to do with that?
Wait, say your question again, I'm sorry.
Does the ALS assessment rule have anything to do with whether the call itself is billed as advanced life support or basic life support?
Well, I would think so, because that dictates how then the coding is built, go out to the building.
So if the ALS assessment rule applies, the call would be billed advanced life support even though there were no advanced life support procedures used on the call.
Yeah, even if it's being applied correctly.
Do you find it significant in this case that Mark is an EMT 1, having been in administrative capacity since the year 2000? And that other people in his department, including the EMS director, are paramedics?
I didn't really look at that aspect of it.
You don't think that the paramedics might have more knowledge than the
Oh, yeah. I would
EMT
think
1
they would.
department head?
Yeah, I would think they would.
But you didn't think that was important in considering whether or not to fire Mark?
No. That came down to one thing, and that was the size of the award, the size of the penalty the city had to pay.
The city had to pay $4.5 million. Somebody's head had to roll,
There had to be repercussions to it.
and you didn't want it to be yours.
No.
And in fact, there was quite a bit of discontent in the city when the $4.5 million settlement was announced, wasn't
Yes.
there? People were not happy about it.
No, they're not.
It's kind of sprung on them, and they didn't expect it, and so there were a number of people that were upset about it.
Oh, yes.
And city council members were taking some heat over it, weren't they?
Sure. We all did.
And isn't civil service status for an employee designed specifically to protect civil service people from political fallout when unpopular decisions are made?
I don't know the reason for that.
Isn't that what happened here? There was political fallout from this settlement. Somebody had to pay a price.
I don't think it was political fall, it was more operational to a standard. That was my take on it.
You, as the city administrator, when you were faced with the fact that we had a situation to deal with ambulance billing and coding, turned to the department head who was in charge of that department and said, Mark, you need to handle this.
Not exactly.
Well, you said, make sure that Medicare billing and coding are done correctly.
Correct.
And you expected him to do that,
Yes.
and yet you didn't think it would be reasonable for him to turn around and say to his EMS director, you need to make sure that billing and coding are done
Well, I
correctly.
don't think it's unreasonable for him to do that.
Okay. But you expected him to do more than what you did.
Once I found out what the problem was, that's when I notified him. That's when I wrote that on that evaluation, shortly after I had a better grasp of the depth of the problem. At that point, I felt I was on the clock, or so to speak, as much as anyone else with regards to this, and that's why I took action written down with him
Yeah.
at that time.
And told him he needed to make sure it was done correctly.
That's right.
And he took action, not only implementing changes, but also talking to the next person in line underneath him to
I'm sure he
pay
did.
attention
Yeah.
to that. All of which were legitimate and reasonable responses to the directive that you gave him.
Yep.
What's your understanding of medical dispatch, if any?
I don't really have a knowledge of that.
If the information received at dispatch is an important category for implementation of the ALS rule, is medical triage at dispatch an important function?
I would believe so.
Do we still have medical dispatch in the Clinton 911 system?
As far as I know,
We're just beginning to implement it, aren't we?
I think that's correct.
Do you have any information about it?
I don't, I haven't got any feedback on how it works in the field or anything.
Fire department's been pushing for medical dispatch for years, haven't they?
I don't know.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Mr. Doe, please proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Horne, is it more important in your mind that your employees did the coding correctly, or that they shoot for an arbitrary target?
That they do it correctly.
My understanding is that one of the principal reasons that for the termination is that the percentages were still not at the amount that Mr. Walker suggested to you might be an appropriate percentage, correct?
Well, that, we weren't seeing it improve to the extent that they thought that it should.
Towards the arbitrary figure of 70%.
Well, toward the figure we were given from our expert.
And you are aware, are you not, from the response by Chief Regenweather that they did a survey where he checked with 5 other fire departments in this local area on the percentages that they had?
I am aware he did that, yeah.
Okay, and that Clive's percentage was 88.14% for 2009? That's nowhere near that 70%, is it?
No.
Burlington, 2009 was at 100% ALS, correct?
If that's what said, I believe that's right, yeah.
Comanche for 2010 through August 18th was 95%, correct?
I believe that's correct.
And in response to directions to code correctly, which was more important, you heard all of the things that Mr. Regenweather did, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Were you also aware of the things that Andy McGovern did?
In terms
Of making sure that billing and coding, that coding was done correctly?
well, I knew Andy was involved as well, yeah.
Okay,
I knew they went to the training.
all right.
He went as well as the other, as well as them.
And did you know that Joel Atkinson also went?
I did know that, yeah.
Okay, and that the information that they obtained at the ambulance billing conference in St. Louis confirmed that they were doing it properly?
I don't know that.
Okay, you know that the 3 of them discussed the very particular issues at that conference and determined that it was correctly done?
I know they had discussions with people at the conference.
Were you aware that Mr. McGovern worked with Clinton County Communications to improve dispatch protocols?
I was aware of it, but it doesn't surprise me.
Were you aware that he worked to implement a system to crosswalk emergency medical dispatch codes with ambulance condition codes for more accurate documentation by report authors?
No.
Did you know that he required report authors to enter an EMD code in their report and to use the crosswalk spreadsheet for the ambulance condition code needed for the appropriate dispatch field?
I didn't know the steps specifically they were taking.
Okay. Did you know whether or not he implemented new and updated documentation policies of the 3 policies that council talked with you about?
They did talk about that, but not in great specifics.
And those were instituted May 28, 2010.
Right, real recently.
Okay. Were you aware that Mr. McGovern continued to request through the fire chief to city administration that ambulance billing be outsourced?
We had discussions about it, but I didn't have a discussion with Andy specifically about it.
Were you aware that Andy McGovern, on an annual basis, had been requesting outsourcing of ambulance billing since at least 2003?
That I'm not aware of. I had most of my contact, in fact, almost all of it was with Mark.
And you were aware of the request to certify finance and fire department personnel as certified ambulance coders?
Yeah, yes.
And in fact, that funding was approved?
Yep.
And it didn't happen because of the terminations before the certification conference?
No, we wanted to go ahead with it.
Okay.
I wasn't sure at that time what was gonna happen down the line.
So once the terminations occurred, you had to decide if there's gonna be somebody else to go, or if you were going to outsource?
Yeah,
Were you aware that Andy McGovern did more thorough weekly audits to ensure that documentation for ALS assessments or interventions for those types of conditions were appropriate?
I wasn't aware specifically what was going on.
Okay. Now, were you aware that there was more PCR documentation classes or patient care report documentation classes from KIPP Ireland?
I knew there were classes, I didn't know which specific, I knew about the St. Louis seminar and about a local one, but once again, we didn't get into what was taught in the classes, really.
you weren't aware of a lot of these things because you didn't ask anyone, did you?
Well, we had at the end of April, at that point, and I had followed up again since then. I knew that they had done some of this stuff, so I didn't follow up with them again. I was waiting, like I said, the next time I had an evaluation for Mark, it would have been more germane at that point. We reviewed all that what was done. We just never got to that point.
What about for Andy? Did you think about reviewing those things that he may have done after this lawsuit process was begun to determine if he was responsive to the issues in the
No,
lawsuit?
I wouldn't have, because, like I said, Mark was the department head.
Are those the types of things that would come out perhaps in an investigation, if an investigation were performed prior to terminating someone?
Well, if there was an investigation on that, we already knew about the award before the termination of the penalty, excuse me,
Okay.
the penalty.
And so the primary issue in this case is that because of the size of the award and penalty, there had to be repercussions, somebody needed to be fired.
We felt that was caused.
You felt that it was, the amount of the settlement that the city council approved was cause for terminating civil service
We
employees.
felt the size of it was cause enough.
Did
And the
Mr.
fact that there were a lot of them over different years
A lot of what?
of problems from what our expert witness had told us.
What specific bill did your expert review?
Well, just the different bills here, we didn't go over a specific bill,
He didn't review any bills, did he?
not bills, he reviewed the call sheets.
He reviewed call sheets, but the lawsuit was about bills, wasn't it?
Right,
And the allegation of the lawsuit wasn't about whether a narrative was changed because of some computer issue, it was about using the wrong codes.
right.
So you never heard from your expert on the code issue because he didn't get that far.
We did not have anyone else coding inside besides Andy.
I thought the paramedics coded and he reviewed
He
their
did.
quality assurance program.
Yes.
It was a spot audit by
Yeah.
him. Okay. And so can you tell me which codes were wrong?
Specifically, not off the top of my head.
You don't have evidence of any specific bill that had a wrong code on it, do you?
Of a bill,
Yep.
well, we went back and reviewed them, we were scared the coding sheets were not correct. So that was the basis of the settlement. We were afraid if the government got in and really went after it, the city would be on the hook for a lot of money, and that was the cause of it.
You were afraid. You
I
were-
didn't have first-hand knowledge, so I had to rely on the best information I had at the time.
And the best information at the time was from an expert who didn't give a report, either verbally or in writing, with regard to the issue that was the issue of the lawsuit.
Right,
So you had a fear that there could be a large amount of money if you didn't settle.
I could not, in my mind, justify risking a bankruptcy for the city of Clinton.
And I understand that. That's why people settle cases all the time.
That's right.
That's not why people get fired, is it?
But it's, that there had to be a repercussion to it.
And so, in terms of the repercussions, you gave Andy McGovern on August 9th, 24 hours to resign or be fired.
We actually ended up giving him more time than that.
But the initial threat was you have 24 hours,
Yeah.
and then he got counsel. Then you were told that you had a bunch of constitutional problems, that you had to come up with specific information as to why he was to be fired. You recall that?
I don't recall those terms being used.
Do you recall Mr. McGovern sending you a specific letter telling you that he was not waiving his rights under Iowa code?
Yeah, I remember that.
And he cited the Constitution of the state of Iowa, he cited the Constitution of the United States, and he cited a specific Supreme Court case of Cleveland Board of Education versus Loudermill.
Right.
And again, all you did was give him additional time. Did you, in fact, conduct any investigation of Mr. McGovern?
A separate investigation, no,
And why did you not do that?
because we already knew the settlement the government.
Isn't it true that it's the policy of the city of Clinton to engage in an investigation before a termination process involving a firefighter?
If I would've had an accusation, that would've been the case. I had a fact in hand.
What fact did you have in hand other than that the city was afraid and decided to settle for $4.5 million?
That was it. The city had a $4.5 million settlement.
And so you had no, well, let me come back. Why would you have a specification of charges against Mr. McGovern other than to say, we have a fact of a $4.5 million settlement, therefore you must be fired? What's the purpose of your specification of charges?
Because we were following procedure.
So you put the form over the substance. Is that correct?
No. We had to follow due process.
Well, you didn't follow due process in the other portion of terminating him before he got to the Civil Service Commission, did you?
Well, I thought we did.
He requested that he be given a pre-termination hearing. He was not given a pre-termination hearing, was he?
He did get to respond,
He was given an opportunity to provide documentation in writing.
right?
He was not given charges, correct?
Separate charges, no.
Didn't tell him what he was doing wrong or what the charges would be, just said he was gonna be fired, and it had to do with this case in the settlement.
We outlined it to him. We had our attorney at the time, Dave Pillars, prepared the right documents, and we got them to him, to you, I believe.
And Mr. McGovern, through me, requested that he be given access to the software company that found problems with the billing software, didn't he?
He did ask, yeah.
And he was refused all access, wasn't he?
That was a misunderstanding. We did not, I thought he wanted to do the system, our system. And that's not, it wasn't presented to me like you just did. Otherwise, we would've got it for him.
He just wanted to have contact with
I
the
didn't-
specific person.
He didn't need my permission to do that.
He was specifically given a letter saying he was barred from having any contact with them. Do you recall that?
No. But we weren't trying, if he wanted in there for that, I thought he wanted into the system, is how it was presented to me. We didn't want him in the system.
After he was given an opportunity to respond to the pre-termination issues, we sent a lengthy response with exhibits, etc., at 4:58 p.m. on October 4th. Do you recall that?
That sounds right.
Did you even look at the response?
Yeah, not in a while.
No, did you look at it before you rejected it?
Yes, I looked at it.
Did you review each and every exhibit that he produced?
Not thoroughly.
Did you read page by page, line by line of the response?
Probably not, no.
Did he get any opportunity for a fair hearing by you giving any consideration at all to the response that he produced?
We gave him the right to make a response.
You gave him the right to make a response that was a hollow right because you didn't give it any due consideration, did you?
I thought we had a case in hand and I filed for it with it.
So it didn't matter what he said in response because you weren't gonna take it into consideration?
Sort of, I wouldn't say that, but it would have taken something earth-shattering. I don't know what that would have been.
And is that why, after receiving something after hours on October 4th, within an hour of the start of business on the 5th, you already had a typed response sent and faxed to my office?
We had
Denying
discussed it over the time, yeah.
In fact, was the letter prepared before you received the response?
I don't know.
Is it possible that the letter was prepared before the response was received?
I don't know.
Were you the person directed by the city to respond to the subpoena that we requested in response to these proceedings?
Partially, but several of us got the stuff that you guys were asking for.
Who was it that was tasked with the responsibility for providing copies of Mr. McGovern's emails?
That would be the information services.
And are you aware of any emails that we received in response to the request?
She had a hard time getting them all into a disc, so she printed them all off.
Were those emails sent?
I thought they were.
Were there any emails with regard to outsourcing?
I didn't know. I wasn't looking for that.
Did you know that there was a specific request for any and all documentation and emails with regard to outsourcing issues?
I think, well, the request was for all the emails.
Okay. There was also a request for copies of any reports and memorandum regarding any issues relating to upgrades of the software affecting historical records or service calls. Do you recall that?
That sounds right, yeah.
No documentation was produced in response to that, was there?
I don't think there was anything. We looked for everything.
Excuse me, what subpoena are you referring to?
This is the subpoena that was issued in request to these proceedings for documentation that was, let's see when it was issued. I believe it was on November 11, 2010.
I don't believe, I'm not sure that we ever got that subpoena. I'm familiar with one from November 18th, last Thursday.
It would have been the only subpoena that was issued, that we had issued.
The only subpoena we have in our file is dated November 18th, 2010.
Yes. November 18th is the subpoena that I'm discussing. And specifically on that November 18th subpoena, item number 13 with regard to any service records, service calls, with regard to that software. You're not aware of any service calls, the documentation regarding that?
No.
Were you aware, did you discuss with anyone that there were numerous service calls with regard to that software?
We tried to get as much of the documentation together in that time as we could.
So some documentation that was requested in the subpoena, you got, some documentation you didn't?
I don't know, I mean, we tried to get everything that was in there in a short period of time.
With regard to the City of Clinton contracts with Medicare and Medicaid for ambulance billing, we only received the one in 2008. Do you know why there were no others?
I don't.
You indicated in response to the prior question that you started to talk about outsourcing this year. Were you not aware of all of the previous efforts at outsourcing?
Maybe in a cursory way, but not, there was a lot of things going on back during budget time.
I've given you a handful of documents, and I'll tell you when we get to each one. The first one that I want you to look at is the second document. It has Exhibit M3. That is the job description for the accounting specialist and accounts receivable. You recognize that to be Sarah's job function? Okay. Now, it indicates on Exhibit M3 that her job was the very first item to process ambulance billings.
Right.
Okay? Now, you've indicated that she was not in charge of ambulance billings, but she merely processed, she was a processor?
That's right.
Okay. What's the difference between processing ambulance billings and performing ambulance billings?
It's just semantics.
Okay, so, at least in terms of that job description, processing ambulance billings shows up in the finance department for her job as an accounting specialist.
Right.
All right. If you look at M4, do you recognize this to be a printout of the website for the City of Clinton Finance Department?
Yes,
Happens to have your name on it.
it does.
You're the acting finance director in addition to your other duties.
Right now, that's correct.
And it says in the fourth full paragraph, the treasury activity includes cash management, investments, ambulance billing, and collections, correct?
Correct.
It does not reference processing ambulance billing, does it?
No.
The responsibility is there for ambulance billing. Is that correct?
In the department,
Yes.
to send out the bills, not to do everything but code.
It says ambulance billing is the
Yes,
responsibility.
billing.
Okay, and then whoever is the supervisor of that department would supervise the individuals responsible for the various functions.
Right.
Well, one of those things also indicated in the first paragraph is risk management.
Yes.
And risk management has to do with that fear of having to pay a sort of a lawsuit that would make somebody bankrupt.
In this case, it's more about, are they talking about more from the insurance perspective?
Why would it have to do with insurance perspective as opposed to anything within their department?
Because she specifically, before I got there, and it was that way, is that they worked through the insurance, the property and casualty, and the work, insurance specifically.
So is it your testimony that the finance department has no role in risk management other than insurance?
I wouldn't say that, no.
Okay, well, what other types of things would that risk management?
I just think
extend to?
that's what it meant, like, in the context of this webpage.
Okay, but in terms of the finance director's role as the supervisor,
Sure.
it would be that person's responsibility to make sure the person doing ambulance billing and collections had the tools necessary to do the job properly.
Yeah.
One document I don't have in front of you and I will get for you is the city's Exhibit 7, which is the EMS training director's job description.
Okay.
Now, have you reviewed the Exhibit 7 EMS training director job description prior to today?
I've looked at it before, yeah.
Okay. Would you agree with me that somebody has made changes to the EMS training director's job description?
You mean in terms of the cross-outs and that stuff?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know when those cross-outs and add-ins were made?
I don't.
Do you know why the job description that is listed in Exhibit 7 of the city's exhibits is different than the one I received in my subpoena?
No, I don't.
I would I'll show you the one that I received, but primarily, it does not have any of the cross-outs, and it does not have any of the additions.
Yeah.
Same on the second page. You know, nothing on the second, nothing on the third. Just the top. Now, is there a reason why the job description itself is not signed by the employee, the supervisor, or the department director?
Probably just came out of the computer. That's my guess as well.
Is it your understanding that job descriptions were changed in response to a survey and employee wage classification study?
Yeah, that was done before, just before I got here.
Okay, and the,
I don't
exhibit-
know which all positions were affected by that, though.
Okay. All right, can you show me in Exhibit 7, I guess I need to give it back to you, where it shows that Mr. McGovern has responsibility for ambulance billing.
It doesn't say.
So nowhere in his job description does it have any statement that his job includes ambulance billing.
Right, he didn't do the billing.
Now, because the city had to put something down in the specification of charges, because that's what the process required, the specification of charges says he was responsible for billing, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And the city's own documents seem to indicate quite the contrary, don't they?
Billing directly, that's correct.
Now, I want to direct your attention to the exhibits that I gave you. Exhibit 5 is a series of recent emails Mr. McGovern had with one of the service providers that has been giving billing proposals to the city since 2003. And specifically, the Exhibit 5 deals with a Florette Ryan of Southwest Sales Suite and Orbitus Company that had been making such proposals to the city since July 31, 2003.
Which 5? M5?
M5, I'm sorry. Were you aware of any documentation kept on outsourcing proposals coming from 2003?
No,
So there's no records that you would be aware of that happening?
no.
Exhibit M6, if you look where it says printed on 8/16/2010, this is a printout of an email completion date 3/10/2003, indicating that Southwest Sales Representative for Suite and Orbitus Company was giving information to Andy on billing and what their collections would be if they were used as an outside service provider, correct?
That's what it looks like, yeah.
The same would be true for documents M7, M8, M9, M10, M11, and M12, all dealing with Andy's efforts to get outsourcing of the EMS billing for various reasons for the city from 2003 until 2009. You agree with that?
That's what it looks like, yes.
Now, Exhibit M13, you have that in front of you. This is a document we received in response to the subpoena to the city. If you turn to page 4,
What number are you on now?
this is M13. And M13, you recognize that to be minutes from a committee of the whole meeting from 2003.
Yes.
And at page 4, then Councilmember Oakley, if you look under Finance Department, Information Technology, and Civil Service, the very short one-sentence paragraph, Councilmember Oakley inquired about whether outsourcing the ambulance billing was under consideration. See that?
Yeah, I see it.
And the then city administrator advised the staff was looking into that matter.
Yep.
Do you have any reason to believe that that wasn't also as a result of Andy McGovern's efforts to try and get the city to outsource ambulance billing?
I have no reason to believe it's not, or any reason at all.
Then 1 month later, Exhibit M14, there was a recommendation to the then city administrator, joint recommendation, it appears, by the finance director and the fire chief, with regard to ambulance fees and billing practices, correct? And despite the evidence of the emails that we just showed you on Andy's efforts to get it outsourced, the decision was made and recommended not to outsource the ambulance billing in 2003.
That's what it happened.
The city had no other documents responsive to our subpoena requesting evidence of Andy McGovern's efforts to outsource. Is that correct?
There'd be nothing else I could think of.
Document M18 that is in front of you. This is a document that the city produced in response to our subpoena. Are you able to explain what M18 is? Is this something that you received about outsourcing in response to the more recent efforts to outsource?
I have that one.
Just give them this one.
Oh, I didn't. You do? Sorry, I didn't.
It's right on top.
Yeah, I got it. I don't know what happened to it. Oh, there it is.
Do you recognize M18 to be a document that the city produced in response to the subpoena?
Yes.
And is this something that the city had most recently with regard to outsourcing of ambulance billing?
Is this from our recent discussion?
Yes.
No.
Okay. Where did the city find this document?
We must have had it in a file that we were from the previous time looking at.
Okay.
'Cause that's what I just had the staff do, just trying to find the stuff that was requested.
All right. And in this file of information was his recommendation that all but the largest providers contract out for the billing services for ambulance billing,
Right,
because he deemed it to be a very complex process needing a dedicated staff.
right.
And the city of Clinton had a part-time, or 50% of the process of a person dedicated to ambulance billing.
Right,
And she had no training on ambulance billing.
right.
Now, if you look at Exhibit M2, which is the Chapter 17 on employee discipline,
Okay.
on the very first page, it requires that employee discipline be lawful under 2.4. You see that?
Yes,
And by that, it says, the discipline and the procedure which is administered does not violate city personnel rules or administrative regulations. You see that?
mm-hmm,
And then, if you turn to page 17-4,
yes,
section 7 specifically requires an investigative process, doesn't it?
yes,
And so if, under 7.1, if there's an accusation of misconduct involving a fire department members, it is to be thoroughly investigated before formal action is taken. You agree that's what it says?
I do agree with that.
And you agree that there was no thorough investigation before formal action was taken against Mr. McGovern?
We talked about that, and we, Mr. Pillars and I felt at the time, and Mr. Pillars was the city attorney at the time, that we already, that it didn't require an investigation for this because we already had the fact.
And the fact was the payment, of the
Yes.
settlement amount.
So,
It had nothing to do with any conduct of Mr. McGovern or not that you were going to fire him, it was the fact of the payment.
well, the conduct was what led to the payment.
And that conduct was allowing somebody to make an allegation that was neither founded nor unfounded because nobody ever got to the bottom of it.
We got the bond it to the point where we ended up having to pay the settlement.
So ultimately, it comes down to the settlement.
The settlement is the big issue.
Okay. It also indicates that you're not to make judgments until a thorough investigation is concluded, but no thorough investigation occurred for the reasons you just stated. Correct?
Yep.
It also indicates for accusations or complaints of serious misconduct, an investigative report must be completed. And there was no investigative report completed either, was there?
No.
And you're supposed to, under 7.2, have a summary of the incident, answering the questions who, what, where, when, and why, and that wasn't done.
No.
You were under 7.3 to conduct interviews, including the interviewee, rank, assignment, date, time, location, those present, and what was discussed. That was not done, was it?
No.
As part of the employee discipline process under 7.4, you were supposed to have an employee history done, correct? Did you do an employee history of Mr. McGovern before firing him?
We did talk about that, yeah.
And did you create a summary of his commendations, performance ratings, and previous disciplinary actions concerning the employee?
No, not a separate summary.
And did you review the departmental personnel file on Mr. McGovern?
We did look at it.
Okay. And Mr. McGovern had an exemplary personnel file, didn't he?
His file was fine.
And one of the reasons for that employee history is to take into consideration any mitigation based upon the previous status of that employee.
Right.
And in this situation, Mr. McGovern's previous status was exemplary.
It was fine.
That's all I have.
Mr. Sibbald?
Big question about whether there are checks and balances with regard to billing. Wasn't Andrew McGovern the check? Wasn't that his responsibility to check to make sure that those codes were correct?
From the field, yes.
And that, to make sure that information was correct before it was sent to the billing department?
That's correct. That's my understanding.
And even the information that you just went over showed that the finance department processed the bill.
Right. They did the actual billing, but they didn't do any coding there. They just took what they got and sent it out.
You were questioning about the $45 difference between the ALS rate and the BLS rate.
Right.
That really wasn't the issue though, was it?
No.
Wasn't it the trouble damages and the fines?
Yes.
And while you were taking heat over $4.5 million settlement, do you suppose the heat would have been any lighter for $20 million or $30 million?
It would have been a lot heavier.
This was characterized as a political termination? Is that what it was?
No, sir.
Why do you say that? Explain yourself.
We felt it was a cause, you know, consulting with me and then the city attorney at the time, Dave Pillars, and so we felt it met the level of cause for termination.
And what was that cause?
The size of the settlement or with the actions that led to it.
There were no debates at the settlement on the merits of the case, you said.
Right.
It was all about settlement.
Yeah.
Hadn't you, through Mr. Walker and Mr. Wolfberg, determined that the case did have merit?
Yeah, we felt, I mean, it had merit, and talking to them about it, and, you know, taking the advice of our expert witness, yeah, it had merit.
The same things they testified about today, the
Yes.
concerns that were raised.
That's
The
correct.
difference with the two separate narrative reports.
Right.
And things like that. that cost concern that couldn't be explained.
Right.
That even Cape Ireland came up here and said that one shouldn't be.
Right.
And the person responsible was Mr. McGovern,
Correct.
initially responsible.
Yes.
And ultimately then, Mr. Regenweiler is the chief.
Correct.
I have nothing further.
Mr. Fry.
You heard Mr. Wolfberg say that he was not a computer expert,
Yeah.
and you heard Mr. Wolfberg say that he expected somebody would make an inquiry of a computer expert to determine if there was some computer explanation, which is what Andy suspected for the difference in the reports. Correct?
Would you rephrase that again? Sorry.
You heard Mr. Wolfberg say today that he expected that Mr. Walker or someone would make an inquiry of a computer expert to
Yes.
see if there might be some basis to believe Andy's suggestion of what might have happened.
Right.
That was never done,
No.
was it?
But we didn't get that far into the case.
No. But yet, you were satisfied that you had to settle the case.
I was satisfied that we had enough on the information I had from our counsel, our expert witness, that there was enough there.
You heard $30 million, and that was all you needed to hear, wasn't
That was part of it. Just the fact that we felt just the amount of them, that it was likely they could come in and do something. There's going over thousands of claims.
it? That's all I
Mr. Doe?
Thank you. Can you tell me from Exhibit 7, if you need it, I can give you another copy. If you need it?
Which one's that one?
That's Mr. The governance job description.
Oh, okay.
City Exhibit 7, yes.
Can you tell me from Exhibit 7, if it indicates, and then if so, where, that Mr. McGovern has responsibility for making sure that building codes are appropriately put on the PCR reports?
Required EMS documentation.
That he is to provide protocols on how to do that? Right?
Complete state required EMS documentation.
What does the state EMS documentation have to do with building codes?
Medicare and Medicaid are run through the states.
Okay? And that documentation, as you've heard from other testimony, coding is usually done outside of the PCR reports, correct? So those didn't have to be done for any particular purpose other than billing.
That's right, it needs to be done for billing.
So he was being proactive in writing protocols and policies and procedures so that they would in fact have that done before it went to the building department, even though that wasn't in his job description.
Well, I think it is partially in his job description at least. I think it's required, state required EMS documentation.
In order to bill it,
Yeah.
but it's not required as part of a patient care report.
No.
Now, we'll never know, will we, if was zero liability on behalf of the city, or 4.5 million in liability, or 20 million in liability because it never went to court.
That's correct.
So it's entirely possible, is it not, that all of the coding was correct?
I suppose it's possible, it's unlikely.
And your expert did not come up with a report indicating that it was not correct, did he?
No.
And he didn't do that verbally or in writing, because he only came up with an issue with regard to the facts on 2 different copies of the reports.
Right.
And that had nothing to do whatsoever with Schultheis's complaint or the litigation.
He felt that there was something which made it plausible that there was possibly something to Schultheis's complaint. That's how it was
Because-
explained to me by him.
Because he couldn't explain it and it might look bad. That was the only evidence he had.
Well, that there could be something to the complaint.
But the complaint was on a different issue, wasn't it?
Well, he felt it could possibly give some credence to that issue.
And he never went any further on the original issue of the complaint, right?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, that's all.
Mr. Horne, just one question on behalf of the commission. Can you point any where in the documentation before you where it says that specifically that coding for Medicare billing purposes is the responsibility of the fire department or any employee in the fire department?
No, I can't.
Isn't that what that means though, when it says that you just read, evaluates all ambulance responses to ensure quality medical care is provided and documented, complete state required EMS documentation, isn't that what
That's how I would
we're
interpret
talking
that.
about?
Yes, that's why I
Isn't
mentioned.
that how we've always done it, the city's done it?
Yes.
Is that's the responsibility of the EMS director?
He asked me if is it written like he said, but that's the way I would also have it. That's been the responsibility. It was never once presented to me that there was gonna be coding done at the building through the finance department. Or was ever done that way.
Nothing further.
Okay.
We'll take a break until 4:45.
City rest.
Thank you.
Too old to sit that long, Mayor.
You should have got, you guys should have got nicer chairs.
I know it.
Good to have another one.
That's an answer. I'm sorry, but, you know, I had a problem with Thanks. I didn't realize you were, I didn't realize there was that explanation.